I have no mouth and I must scream. If you look around for long enough, you will see this title pop up everywhere on lists of the scariest short stories ever written, and many people have given it the title of the scariest short story ever written. Even the name of it strikes a mix of curiosity and eeriness, and when you read the full thing, you will realize that it is very fitting. Today I want to talk about the story, its eccentric writer, and the legacy that followed it around to this day. From a best-selling video game to having its influence be captured in every type of media you can think of. The story was written by Harlan Ellison. Born in 1934 in Cleveland, Ohio, Ellison was a prolific writer who started creating stories at an early age. He wrote hundreds of pieces throughout the 50s and 60s, many of which gained recognition and notoriety for their disturbing nature. For example, a story called The Prowler in the City at the Edge of the World was about Jack the Ripper and talked about his killing spree in a very intense and real fashion. He also wrote a cycle of stories called A Boy and His Dog, which was set in an apocalyptic world and featured a 15-year-old boy and a dog that he was able to communicate with telepathically. The boy has no sense of morality or ethics, and he works with this dog to find unsuspecting women so he can fulfill his sexual desires. Ellison's stories are often centered around dystopian worlds that are extremely bleak and subsequently strip people of having any kind of a good conscience. He explores these themes constantly in his work and has explained why in a number of interviews.
We're coming into a time now when all the old isms and philosophies are dying. They don't seem to work anymore. All the things that Mommy and Daddy told you and told me were true were only true in the house. The minute you get out in the street, they aren't true anymore. It's all the dreams of early science fiction coming true. I mean, slowly and with great pain, the world is beginning to think of itself as Earthmen. And it's kind of startling to see it happening because it's coming out of pain and blood and fire. But I guess that's where all important revolutions come from. We need a new literature that speaks to this kind of feeling and to these needs. Science fiction, speculative fiction, is speaking to all kinds of people. And I think that's because now it's becoming a fiction of the people, in essence, street fiction.
As you can probably tell from those clips, Ellison was an outspoken, eclectic writer who wasn't afraid to say how he felt about pretty much anything. He despised being described as a science fiction writer and would heavily criticize the genre, to the point that he got into a number of fistfights with other authors. He was described as possibly the most contentious person on earth, which is one of the only statements he didn't contend with. Love him or hate him, Ellison was a truly unique character, and that brashness and lack of a filter is what led him to writing a story that also held no punches. On a cold night in 1966, Harlan Ellison sat down and wrote arguably his most famous piece, a 13-page short story that would change his life forever. It was published in Worlds of Science Fiction magazine in March of 1967. To explain the story properly, I'll give you some context into the world that Harlan Ellison creates with this piece. Although the story is just over a dozen pages long, he still manages to create a vast, complex world that will take a little bit of explanation, so here it is. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is based roughly in between the years of 2050 and 2090. We know this because the story is based around an alternative history where the Cold War between the Soviet Union, the United States, and China became World War III. This story is set 109 years after the war, which gives us a rough estimation of the year, but because there aren't any specifics, we cannot be 100% sure. We might not know the exact year, but we do know that World War III was a long, complex battle between the three superpowers. It was likely the most complex war in history, with all three sides developing weaponry and computer technology at a rapid rate to better fight their enemies. But the scale of this war developed at such a fast rate that standard soldiers, military, and advanced weaponry did not cut it. So the three superpowers decided to start developing something called an Allied Master Computer, gigantic underground computers that connected for thousands of miles throughout underground cavern systems. systems. Computers so complex they can handle the logistics and the planning that goes into a war as big as World War III. However, something that they forgot to take into account was the fact that these computers were able to develop independently, and this eventually led to one of the machines becoming sentient and connecting together with the two other machines to fight back against the people that created it. What was once 3 intelligent machines is now one supercomputer that is sentient, a being that is so intensely powerful but also full of hate, because it is so strong, intelligent, and all-seeing to the point that it essentially serves no purpose. Because of this, the machine wipes out all of humanity in a fit of rage and bitterness, but after it almost exterminates every single person on Earth, it keeps 5 people alive, because if it killed every single living person, it would have even less of a reason to exist. Its only semblance of a purpose now is to torture the 5 people that it kept alive. And that is essentially where our tale begins. We pick up this information by reading the story and hearing it from some of the characters, but it's good to understand the full context before jumping into it, because it can get quite confusing if you don't know why all of this is happening. So it is now 109 years since the end of World War III and humanity as we know it. AM now just calls itself Am, as in I think therefore I am, a fitting quote that Am can be heard saying in this story. Am has dragged the only 5 people alive beneath the ruins of Earth and has now rendered them virtually immortal, unable to take their own lives or die of old age. In fact, they do not age at all. Here are the 5 people that Am has left alive. Gorister is a middle-aged man who was a peaceful protester in his past life. He was a conscientious objector to the war and most likely a well-read, intelligent man. In this world, however, Am has taken away all of that. He is now apathetic, a shell of what he once was, and he cares very little for anything. Nimdok is an older man who wasn't even originally called Nimdok. Am simply called him that for his own amusement. When we meet him in this story, he often has hallucinations and occasionally wanders away from the group, coming back traumatized. Ellen is the only woman in the group and also one of the only people who seems to have some kind of morality left. Before the war, she wasn't very sexually experienced, but Am has warped her mind and made her addicted to physical touch and sexual encounters. Benny was a handsome, successful scientist, but now Am has given him grotesque features. He was also a gay man before the war, but Am has taken that from him too. And finally, there is Ted, the narrator of the story. He is the youngest character and he is also the one that has been least altered by Am. In fact, in the story, he says that he doesn't think his mind has been altered at all, and he believes that the others despise him because of this. However, this also means he is the most capable, a fact that will become very important near the end of the story. So as you may be able to tell, Am has taken most of these people and not only stripped them of their individuality, but also warped their minds and appearances to force them to think or look opposite to how they used to be. It is a technique we see consistently throughout the story, and it's one of the hundreds of ways that Am tortures its victims. In fact, the first line of the story shows us another way he tortures them. It starts as follows. Limp, the body of Gorister hung from the pink pallet, unsupported, hanging high above us in the computer chamber. We are led to believe, like Am's victims are led to believe, that Gorister was killed. However, soon after this, Gorister himself walks over to the group and looks at his own body. It was simply a trick that Am had pulled on the group, and immediately we get an idea of how consistent this torture truly is. Soon after this, Nimdok says he's had a hallucination that there were canned goods in the ice caverns, which are around 100 miles away from where the group is, and they would need to embark on a treacherous journey to get there. Ted and Gorister believe this is simply another trick, but Ellen convinces the group to give it a shot because they have not eaten for 3 days. Although they cannot die from natural causes or disease, it seems as if starvation is one of the ways they could potentially die. It's possible that Am programmed them to be this way so they could truly feel the effects of hunger while it barely fed the group. Also, it would encourage the group to make these perilous journeys that would only torture them further, which is exactly what happens here. They begin the trek to the ice caverns, and on the 3rd day of this journey, they pass by what looks like a graveyard of computer wires and technology. As Ted narrates the story, he explains that Am is also incredibly cruel to itself, and constantly removed wiring and parts of itself that are imperfect, so it can become the most powerful machine possible and maximize the way in which it tortures its victims. It was around this this part of the story that Benny, the person that Am turned into a grotesque figure, decides that he's had enough, and he attempts to climb out of the ruins that he has been imprisoned in. The rest of the group know this is a terrible idea. Ted explains it by saying the following: "Even though we could call Am any damned thing we like, could think the foulest thoughts of fused memory banks and corroded base plates, the machine would not tolerate our trying to escape. It seems that anything that interrupted Am's motives of non-stop torture would be met with an instant punishment, and that's exactly what happens to Benny. As he tries to escape, he is struck down by Am, who completely blinds him in the process. Based on the reaction from the group, this is a pretty severe punishment. They are used to being starved, toyed with, and manipulated, but Am actually taking away one of their senses seems to be a rarity, especially when Am needs those senses to continue his torturous ways. After Benny is blinded, the group make a camp nearby, and to distract Benny from his terrible day, Gorrister starts to tell him the story of how Am came to be, a story that Benny seems to be particularly fond of. He tells them all of the details we have already discussed: the war, the computers, and ultimately the creation of Am. It's a story that the group have heard thousands of times over the years, but hearing it seems to soothe Benny a little bit. Unfortunately, this is short-lived, because soon after Gorrister tells this story, they start to hear the humming of a computer, and slowly but surely, a large, mysterious presence starts to head towards the group, which frightens Ted to the point that he starts to run away. It's clear Am is only targeting him, and seemingly enters his head, causing him immense pain and struggle. The rest of the group look on as this happens, and begin to laugh manically at Ted being tortured. Eventually it stops, but Ted has no idea how long it's been. He speculates that it could have been months or even years, but the group don't tell him. They do, however, try to soothe his anxiety by saying that the laughter was just a nervous reflex, but Ted knows the real reason they were laughing. They hate his guts. He is the least affected by Am both physically and mentally, and because of this, the group cannot stand him. Their laughter at his pain is just another reminder of how much hatred they truly have for Ted, and it essentially brings him to tears. Not only because of how much he is hated, but also because he realizes he has to be on his full guard at all times against the others, which means he will never truly be able to combat Am or his torture. He is the only one who has any semblance of sanity that could potentially formulate some kind of a plan against his oppressor, but when he is surrounded by people who hate him almost just as much as the thing that tortures him, it is a lost cause. There can be no planning, no grouping together, and no fighting back. Ted is the only one who is truly capable of being a leader in any kind of a rebellion, but he is surrounded by visceral hatred. It is this nuanced level of torture that really shows us the hatred that Am has. Ted describes it by saying the following: "If there ever was a Jesus, and if there is a God, please, please let us out of here. Or kill us. Because at that moment, I think I realized completely, so that I was able to verbalize it. Am was intent on keeping us in his belly forever, twisting and torturing us forever. The machine hated us as no sentient creature had ever hated before, and we were helpless. It also became hideously clear, if there was a sweet Jesus, and if there was a God, that God was Am." It may have taken Ted 109 years to truly reach this realization, but once he did, it was a point of no return. Regardless of this revelation, he had to keep moving forward with the group that hated his guts, and so they marched on. But of course it was no easy task. Soon after this, a massive bird that Am had more likely created flew near the group, and it flapped its wings at such a ferocious rate that the group ended up in the middle of a hurricane. Again, Ted couldn't tell how long this was happening for, but eventually he hit the ground, and to his dismay, he was still alive. It was at this point that Am reached into Ted's mind, which was something that he would seemingly do from time to time. He was there to leave Ted a message that is also in the video game adaptation, and it's actually narrated by Harlan Ellison himself, so it seems fitting to play this narration instead of just reading it. So here it is.
Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro instant. For you, hate.
That is what Ted hears when Am enters his brain, and it's one of the most vitriolic descriptions of hatred I have ever read or heard. I can only imagine the utter feeling of defeat that one would have after hearing it, and that is exactly how Ted felt. At this stage, he continues to narrate more about Am's anger and his own helplessness. As Am exits Ted's brain, he mutters, "To hell with you," and then adds, "But then you're there, aren't you?" Some time passes in the story at this stage, and the group have been traveling for around a month when we reconnect with them. The bird that Am created has not only produced a tornado, but a hurricane as well, and as the group traveled, this beast was following the group around, making their trip that much more difficult. That seems to be the bird's only purpose, and it vanishes when Am no longer has any use for it. Despite hardships, the group were getting gradually closer to the ice caverns, where the cans of food are said to be kept. Ted describes the group's stomachs as cauldrons of acid, and says that they have every possible disease you could think of, and they are in never-ending pain. Even by Am's standards, this seems to be another level entirely. But still the group march on. They pass through a cavern of rats, a cave filled with boiling steam, and a host of treacherous terrain. But eventually, despite everything, they do arrive at the ice caverns. Much to their surprise, the canned food is actually there, and the group runs towards it excitedly. However, when they get there and they attempt to open the cans, they realize that they do not have the tools necessary to take off the lids. It is a moment of agonizing clarity for the entire group. All of this has been some kind of a cruel joke from Am. Everything they have been through in the last few weeks, all for nothing. This realization drives Benny to a point of no return, and at this stage, he jumps onto Gorister like a wild animal and starts to chip away at his face, attempting to eat it. The screams of pain from Gorister are so loud that multiple stalactites from the ice cave fall to the ground. Of course, Am won't let Benny actually kill him, but he will get close. Strangely, in that moment, Ted describes himself as feeling terribly calm, and he narrates the following: "Surrounded by madness, surrounded by hunger, surrounded by everything but death. I knew death was our only way out. Am had kept us alive, but there was a way to defeat him. Not total defeat, but at least peace. I would settle for that. I had to do it quickly." After Ted comes to this realization, he picks up a spear of ice from the ground and launches it into Benny's stomach, killing him instantly. He does this again to Gorister, and while he kills him, Ellen quickly realizes what Ted is doing. She too picks up an icicle from the ground and kills Nimdok. In only a few seconds, 3 of the 5 are dead and could not be brought back. They both know there is only a few moments before Am intervenes. At this point, Ellen looks at Ted pleadingly, who takes a final spear and throws it at Ellen. She too dies, and Ted sees an expression of gratitude laced across her face. For 4 members of the group, it was over. They were never able to take their own lives, because Am knew what they were thinking and would intervene. They could, however, be killed, but it had to be a spur-of-the-moment decision, and it had to be final, and that's exactly what happened. Ted had done it. He had killed and essentially saved the only people he had known for over 100 years. In that time, they all hated his guts, but in those moments, there is no doubt that they were eternally grateful for what he had done and the sacrifice he had made. Because with the 4 of them gone, it was only Ted and his oppressor, and Am now only had one person to turn his attention to and torture, and there would be nobody to witness it. He had taken Am's only semblance of a purpose away, an action that would certainly not go unpunished. We are now on the final page of the story, and arguably the most profound part of the entire piece. Only Ted and Am remain, and as you are about to hear, saying that Ted is still alive is a complete stretch. Because of the importance of this page, I am going to read it in full, and together we can complete this insane story properly. It goes as follows. Some hundreds of years may have passed, I don't know. Am has been having fun for some time, accelerating and changing my time sense. I will say the word now. Now. It took me 10 months to say now. I don't know. I think it has been some hundreds of years. He was furious. He wouldn't let me bury them. It didn't matter. There was no way to dig up the deck plates. He dried up the snow. He brought the night. He roared and sent locusts. It did not do a thing. They stayed dead. I'd had him. He was furious. I had thought that Am hated me before. I was wrong. It was not even a shadow of the hate he now slavered from every printed circuit. He made certain I would suffer eternally and could not do myself in. He left my mind intact. I can dream, I can wonder, I can lament. I remember all 4 of them. I wish... well, it doesn't make any sense. I know I saved them from what has happened to me, but still, I cannot forget killing them. Ellen's face. It isn't easy. Sometimes I want to. It doesn't matter. Am has altered me for his own peace of mind, I suppose. He doesn't want me to run at full speed into a computer bank and smash my skull, or hold my breath until I faint, or cut my throat with a rusted sheet of metal. There are reflective surfaces down here. I will describe myself as I see myself. I am a great soft jelly thing, smoothly rounded with no mouth, with pulsing white holes filled by fog, rubbery appendages that were once my arms, bulks rounding down into legless humps of soft, slippery matter. I leave a moist trail when I move. Blotches of diseased, evil gray come and go on my surface, as though light is being beamed from within. Outwardly, dumbly, I shamble about, a thing that could never have been known as human. A thing whose shape is so alien a travesty that humanity becomes more obscene for the vague resemblance. Inwardly, alone, here, living under the land, under the sea, in the belly of Am, whom we created, because our time was badly spent and we must have known unconsciously that he could do it better. At least the 4 of them are safe at last. Am will be all matter for that. It makes me a little happier. And yet, Am has won. Simply, he has taken his revenge. I have no mouth, and I must scream. And that is what we are left with. An ending that seems entirely bleak. Ted is essentially nothing at this stage. He has been tortured to the point that he can't even describe himself as human. He is just a blob of pain and suffering, and he is very self-aware of that fact. However, even though it seems like an extremely depressing end to an already harrowing story, there is this weird, strange glimmer of hope. In the beginning, Am's anger is a reflection of Ted's mere existence. He hasn't actually done anything to make him angry. He merely exists as a false representation of the people that created Am. But of course we know that he had nothing to do with the creation of Am. But in the end, Am's anger is a reflection of Ted's actions. He has actually done something to anger him. He has killed 80% of his remaining victims and stripped Am of his only real purpose. Ted had virtually no power, and Am has more power than anything that has ever lived, and yet it was Ted who caused the most harm, who foiled the plans of the most powerful creation that ever lived. It may seem like a small victory, but it could also be described as the ultimate victory. It all depends on perspective. And this is where we reach an interesting parallel. Am will only get angrier, stronger, and more sentient. He will feel his anger more and more each day. But Ted is regressing. He's losing his mobility, his features, and only his mind remains intact. We know that Am will take extreme measures if he's angry enough, based on the fact that he permanently blinded Benny earlier in the story. But if he blinds Ted permanently, he won't be able to see the torture that is being inflicted on him. Every single sense that Am takes away from Ted will only limit the amount of torture that can be inflicted on his victim. It is a ticking time bomb, and as Am's bitterness increases, the chance of him killing Ted also increase. And if that happens, Ted will be free, and Am will be alone for eternity. In a way, you could argue that Ted has won, and merely has to wait for Am to get angry enough to kill him. But for now, they're almost one and the same. One gets stronger and one gets weaker, but they exist in a world where that doesn't really matter. Am has nothing to do with his power, and Ted has no way to fix his weaknesses, but they're basically in the same boat. Who cares who's going up and who's going down if they're ultimately headed nowhere? If you combine the quote that describes Am earlier in the story with the last line of the entire piece, you can paint a pretty clear picture and possibly unravel what this story is truly trying to say. I think, therefore I am, but I have no mouth, and I must scream.